So my name is Tyler Smith and I'm a PDM specialist here at Hawk Ridge Systems, and today I'm going to be talking about managing your data using SOLIDWORKS PDM. So first off, what is SOLIDWORKS PDM? PDM is a way for you to store and manage all of your data in one central location, and with that it will allow you to collaborate more effectively and work more efficiently. So I know these are sort of very vague and broad terms, so before I go too much into talking about the general idea behind PDM, I just want to mention one more thing. Most of this data is typically going to be stored on a server, whether that's a physical server on site or whether you're using some sort of cloud-based solution or virtual machine. That's typically something that's going to be tied in with this PDM system. But again, it's a way for you to store and manage all of your data. And with that, I'm now going to just jump into the software to show you guys what the user interface looks like, and we'll go from there. So the PDM interface, like I mentioned, there is the data that you have stored in PDM is going to be stored on the server, but I need a way to access that information from my local machine. And to do that, what I'm going to do is open up Windows Explorer, and right on my C drive I have this item that doesn't look like the rest of my regular Windows folders here. And what this is my Vault view. So that's essentially my portal into seeing the files that are stored on the server without starting up some sort of remote session or remoting into the server. So you will notice too that as soon as I attempt to log in, it is going to prompt me for credentials. So with PDM, there are credentials are necessary to get into this system. So if you don't have credentials, obviously you can't get into the system, but also these credentials are going to set up what type of access you have inside the system. So do you have read-only access to certain files? Can you edit others? And generally speaking, what files do you have access to? All that can be determined based upon the credentials that have been set up for each individual user or for a user group. But as soon as I log in to my Vault view, you'll see that the general interface looks very similar to what we're used to in Windows Explorer, at least on this upper half here. So you will note that the folders are not the typical yellow Windows folder color that we see over here. Rather, they're green. Part of that's to indicate that you're in this different environment. But otherwise, the user interface is incredibly similar to what users will already be used to working inside the Windows Explorer interface. So dragging and dropping, double click to open, all of that still applies here. We have columns here which we can move around and resize, and the system will remember that for each individual user's installation. The big difference here comes in the bottom half of the screen. So if I browse into one of my SOLIDWORKS files that I have here, you'll see this preview tab, our first tab here. It's actually loading a live preview of this assembly that I have here. So this preview tab is good because if you don't immediately know what a file is, simply by looking at the file name, you can get a preview of that document, a live preview, simply by clicking on it. Or if you have people who are approving documents and they just need to look at a file quickly, they can do that in this preview tab. So it has a lot of functionality there, but also this preview tab is run using a separate program called eDrawings, and you'll see there in the upper right hand corner the eDrawings name there. And the benefit of having this preview generated by eDrawings is that if I don't have SOLIDWORKS, I can still see this preview. And this works for over 250 different file types. So it's going to cover a lot of your more common file types. If you have Office documents, it's going to cover those as well, AutoCAD drawings. So again, if you have approver level users that just need to view the file, they can view that inside this window here. Again, it's a live preview, so they can manipulate that around. They can even take measurements inside here as well if they needed to do that. We also have something called data cards. And data cards are a completely customizable template. And what you're seeing here is just an example of something you could use where we have information about our file that's stored here. And it allows us to add in a lot more information above and beyond what we get in the upper half of this screen. So we can add additional fields in here other than what you're currently seeing. And if you also are using custom properties inside SOLIDWORKS files, you can have custom property information automatically map in from the custom properties menu into this data card. And then if you have that mapping set up and a user makes an edit to that information in the data card, you can also have that change right out to the custom properties menu as well. So it's a pretty powerful tool. Also, anything that's stored in here can be searched for later on. So if I didn't remember the file name, but I remembered that MITRE was in the description field, I could use that to locate this file later on. And the reason all of this is possible is because this PDM system has a SQL database that it's using in the background that's managing our information about our files. It's also managing our reference information. So if I rename a file, I move it to a new location, that's not going to break the reference. So even though this whole thing is Windows Explorer based or embedded inside Windows Explorer, this Vault View interface, you don't have that same issue that you would working in a traditional Windows Explorer interface because that SQL database is managing those references, so they're no longer file path dependent. And another thing to note on here as well, and I mentioned in the preview tab that this the preview tab works specifically for 250 different file types roughly, but that doesn't mean that that the PDM system only works for 250 different file types. Because it's Windows Explorer based, there's really no limit to the types of files you can bring into this PDM system. You could create a new file extension that's never existed before, pull that into this system, and still have the same control that you'd have over any other type of file. And also with that, you can set up different types of data cards for different file types. So you might have a data card for your SOLIDWORKS parts and assemblies, a different data card for Office documents, maybe a different one for ECOs as well. So there's lots of customizability there based upon what you need and what type of information you might want to store about each document. Also with the system, there are versions and there are revisions. So when I'm ready to work with a file, there is a checkout process that I'll go through. So for example, if I wanted to make an edit to this assembly, I could perform what's called a checkout. And what that's doing is giving me exclusive edit access to that assembly at this time. So every other user that's inside the PDM system will see my name next to that assembly. So they'll know that I'm making edits to it. And it will prevent them from making live edits to that document at the same time. So all this means that if you were previously working in a shared network drive environment, something like that, where two people might have the same file open at the same time, one person saves that file, the next person saves their file or saves their version of that file, and it overwrites the first person's changes. This whole checkout process was built in here to prevent that situation from happening. Now, that doesn't mean that since I have this file checked out right now, nobody else can get that file. They can still get a read-only copy of that file, and if they make edits to that read-only copy, they can save that as a new file if they want to. So they still have access to it. But again, it's going to prevent other users from editing the same exact file at the same time. And if I check out a file, make a change to that file, and check it back in, a new version is going to be created. And that's what's indicated here on this version tab. So it's sort of a running tally of all the changes that have occurred to that file over time. But something else that's happening as well is when I check out the file, it's writing that file from the server over to my local cache, which is built into my Vault View here. So if I check out a file, I've put in a day's work into that file. All of those edits that I've made, those are all stored locally on my machine. It's not constantly syncing up with the server, so you don't have to worry about bandwidth issues throughout the day, because the only time it's transferring information from the server and your local machine is during the check-in, check-out process. But also, once we have this file, and if it has multiple versions that have been created over time, I might want to access those at different points in time as well. So you'll see that I have 5 versions of this file. I can go back and get previous versions of this file if I wanted to as well. And you'll see that we have numbered versions, and then we also have lettered revisions. And that's a big distinction here. So I've gone over revisions, but then we also, or I've gone over versions rather, but we also have revisions. So a revision is essentially an elevated version. It's a version that's been through some sort of approval process, so more than one person has looked at that file, and then it will get a revision stamp indicating that that's ready to be released for manufacturing or ready to be released to a customer. So there's a difference there, and we'll see how those revisions come into play with our workflow processes a bit later on. Next, we have a bill of materials tab, and it's going to show me a full bill of materials for this assembly. So any sub-assemblies, any components that are underneath this assembly are going to show up here as I would expect, but this is a bill of materials that's specific to PDM. And the reason why I say that is because we can have custom references that can't exist in the SOLIDWORKS bill of materials. So for example, if I scroll down here, you'll see that I have a PDF that's attached, an assembly instruction that's attached to this miter saw assembly. And because this file is a PDF, it has no 3D geometry, you can't open up SOLIDWORKS and add that file in to the assembly. So obviously these custom references aren't going to show up in the SOLIDWORKS bill of materials. However, inside our PDM bill of materials, these can show up, these can be added, and then once they're added as a reference, they will travel or can travel with that file or with that assembly, just like any other child part, like one of these sub-assemblies or components. And just like the file itself, if I want to go back and look at previous iterations or previous versions of this bill of materials, I can do that. And again, we'll see the numbered versions and the lettered revisions for the points in time when this file was released, and we can see what the bill of materials look like at that point in time. And then also with that in mind, there's a way to compare 2 different versions of the bill of materials. So if I wanted to look at my latest version, version 5, compare that to version 1 when it was originally created, we'll see that there's a key in the bottom right hand corner which tells me what any highlighting might indicate. So in this case, we'll see that these files, the revision has updated, they were added. And then if I scroll down here, you'll see that I also added that assembly instruction there. So it's a way to keep track of changes that have occurred over time in that bill of materials. We also have a contains tab, and this is going to show us some similar information to what we saw in bill of materials. So again, anything that would show up in the feature tree in SOLIDWORKS, we're going to see that here just like we did in bill of materials. We'll also see those custom references, but one of the big differences between contains and bill of materials is we can also see if we can see the version of each file that was referenced. So in this case, we have our assembly here, and it's referencing mostly the latest versions of all these files, with the exception of this file down at the bottom here. So in this case, this file has been updated since it was originally attached or included as part of this assembly. So now it's referencing version 4 of 5. So there is a later version that exists inside the vault that this assembly isn't currently referencing. So this is a good indication to me as the user. I might want to rebuild this assembly with that latest version of the of that file. And then finally, we have a where used tab, and this is going to track anywhere inside the PDM vault. Again, that's just the central location where those files are stored. This is going to help us track anywhere that file is referenced. So if I go to one of my components here, we'll see that instead of seeing the top-down view like we saw before, where we see our top-level assembly, sub-assembly component, we'll see that that's swapped. So instead, we see the component that we've selected, any sub-assemblies that it's a part of, and then any main assemblies that include that sub-assembly with the component underneath it. So this is a good tool if you are maybe potentially considering a change to a shared library part, and you want to see what assemblies might be affected by a change like that. You can come here and you'll see all of the reference listed here as different items. And then that will give you the list of assemblies that might need to be checked if some change is made to a shared library component. So that's the general overview of the Vault View interface. I'm going to show you some of the admin end of things, because this has more been the user side of things. And I mentioned that you can build inside the PDM system some workflows that will allow you to sort of imitate your current approval processes. You can build those into the PDM system. And this is an example of that. So you'll see here, I have this workflow, and it's a pretty simple 3-step process. These rectangles here, these are what are called workflow states. And this actual window here we're seeing is our design workflow. So when files are added into the vault, CAD files specifically, they're going to start off in work in process, they'll move to pending approval, and then finally go to approved. So from the admin side of things, they can build these workflows. It's very simple to add in new states. Maybe you want to add in a minor revision state. You can add in a revision like that, and then you'll see that there are these arrows. These are called transitions, and that's what allows the files to move from one state to the next, and those can also be created from the right-click menu there, and then you can move something from one state to the next and create a new revision that way. So it's very easy. There's no coding required. It's all graphical here. But there's also a lot of automation that can be built into this workflow as well. So things like our revision values, those can be applied as part of this workflow. So when a file moves from pending approval to approved, we can have the revision value update on that file. We can also have things like watermarks added or removed from a file, or notifications sent out, letting a user know that that file is ready to be reviewed, or maybe it's been released, it's ready to go. You want to let all the manufacturing guys know that that file is ready to be released for manufacturing. A lot of that can be built into this workflow, as well as different revision schemes as well. So in this case, what we'll see when I move a file through this workflow process, we'll see that it's using a very simple alpha revision scheme. But if you wanted to set up a more customized, maybe an alphanumeric scheme, maybe you want a prototype revision scheme, or even you could potentially have a custom list of values. Maybe it doesn't start at A, maybe it starts with an IR for initial release, then it moves to A. There's lots of ways to customize this system to fit the way that you are currently working at your company. So from the user side of things, what they'll see is you have this state column, and that shows you which workflow state or which step in the approval process is that file currently sitting. So if I scroll down here, I actually have a drawing of a part, and this is a new part that I'm thinking about swapping in and putting into that miter saw assembly that we saw before. and we can go ahead and take a look at that drawing as well. But this drawing, again, it's a different file type, so it could have its own data card, all of its own information here, and you'll see that it's starting off in that work in process state. So now if I wanted to approve this file, send it through that workflow process, and then once it's good, I can swap that file out and put it into my miter saw assembly. The way that I do that from the user perspective is by right-clicking on the file, and I can move it through that process from this right-click menu here. And you'll see that it's moving both the drawing and the part underneath it at the same time. And I can just say submit for initial review, since this file has never been released. Moves to pending approval, which is that next step in the process. And then finally, once it's done there, I'm going to move it through to approved, and we'll notice a few things that will happen with this file, one of which is the removal of that watermark there. So once I approve this drawing and the part associated with it, we'll see that it moves to approved there. So again, that's what the user will see from their perspective. They're not necessarily going to see all of the full mapping of the workflow process, but you will notice some of our automation, our watermark is gone there. If I scroll in, we can also have things filled out in our title block, like who approved the file and when, revision values. Those can all be written over to the title block automatically as part of our approval process. So that's one of the big benefits of having a system like this. That's another step that might have been done manually previously, people opening up the drawings, manually editing those fields. But with these workflows built into PDM, you can have that done automatically. So it saves you a couple of steps there, and then also that's another step you don't have to worry about somebody putting in a typo or miskeying something, and then maybe you have to do a full new release depending on maybe the quality standards that you might be constrained by. But you may have also noticed when I was showing you what the workflow looked like, there's also this other state that looks a little bit different than the rest of these states. And what this actually is a workflow link. So with PDM Professional, you can create different types of workflows for different file types. So in this case, I have my design workflow. You'll see that I have an ECO workflow as well. And what this allows me to do is if I wanted to send my drawing out or maybe my assembly out into a separate workflow, I want it to go through a different workflow process because there's different steps, different people that need to approve that file when it's going through an ECO process rather than just the general engineering review. I can do that. And again, based upon the transitions that appear here, I'll see those in the right-click menu. And once I've moved that file and its part over, it'll move over to that new workflow. But before I do that, I also want to show what the ECO process might look like. So I actually have an ECO, or you can set up an ECO template where you have files that are created based upon some template file. In this case, I just have a somewhat generic ECO document here. But I can take those ECO files and I can copy them. And then if I go back to the file that that the ECO is going to be applied to, I can actually check out that file and add it as a reference on that file. So maybe I'm going to add that part that I just moved through this approval process. I'm going to add it to my miter saw assembly here. So I'll check out that assembly, And once I've checked that out, I'm going to attach that that custom reference. So again, the custom reference, if we're inside PDM, we'll be able to track that in the bill of materials. It will also move through our approval processes just like any other child part might. And then once we're done with that ECO, we can remove that reference again so it won't be associated with that file anymore. And then the next time there's another ECO, you can attach that as a new reference at that point. And again, if I did attach this ECO as a reference, I could move the assembly and the ECO. I could push those through my approval process all as a unit. Because again, we saw with the drawing and the part that the drawing came from, that we were able to move those through our workflow process all at the same time. So, and occasionally, let's see here. Okay, there we go. So I've checked out my file here, and now I want to attach that ECO as a reference. So it's fairly simple to do. I can once I've checked out the file, I can simply right-click on that file, and then there's an option to paste a file as a reference, and that will create that link between the ECO document and my assembly document that I have here. I'm going to paste that ECO document as a reference onto my assembly, and we'll see that I have an option to adjust the quantity of the document. In this case, it's an ECO, so I'm just going to add one. But in the case of an assembly instruction or something like we saw previously, you might have multiple quantities that you might want to attach. And once I've attached that, I can check that back in, and now that's going to exist as a child reference underneath my assembly there. And then once that's done, I'll go through and I'll push this into my ECO assembly, and we'll see what that looks like. And once it's done, once it's gone through that ECO workflow and it's reached the end, I can actually transition it back over to my design workflow at that point. So it doesn't have to, if it moves from one workflow to another, you'll see that it doesn't have to stay. It can easily transition from one workflow to another. So I'll go ahead and check in that change, and it's going to update the version on my file there from version 5 to version 6, because again, I've changed something about that file. Again, that happens anytime you check out a file, make a change to it, check it back in, that version is updated. If I check out a file, I don't make a change to it, no new version is created, so you don't have to worry about it creating unnecessary versions if no change has taken place. And then I'll go ahead and show what that ECO workflow process will look like. So we have our documents will start off in this first state here, then they'll move down through, and once they've been completed, then I can transition my SOLIDWORKS files back over to my design workflow at that point after they've moved through our ECO process. So again, just like we saw with our part in drawing, if I want to change the state and move it into that ECO workflow, I can select ECO, and that's going to move that file. And I have to be careful here because it might try to move through not just the assembly but files underneath it as well, which I might not want, so I might deselect those things and just move the assembly through. So it moves that to ECO requested, which we'll see is the first step in that ECO process. And once that file has transitioned over there, then at that point we'll move that or step that through our ECO process. Okay, so we have our assembly in our ECO process, and then I can step that through. Again, based upon the permissions that I have as my user, that'll determine who can access the files at which states along my workflow process and what transitions they also have access to. So maybe I'm going to assign the ECO, moves it to ECO in process. Then obviously I might log in as different user at this point and then say, okay, this looks good. I want to complete this ECO. And you'll see that at this point, because I moved this assembly through to this ECO process, which matched the same workflow state that the ECO was in, now we have these files moving as a unit through this approval process. Then it moves over to ECO completed, and then at that point, if I want to move my assembly back over to my design workflow, I can do that here, depending on the permissions that have been granted to that user. So in this case, I need to make sure that I have permissions to do that. And then as long as that's in place, I should be able to go back and say, okay, I want to return that assembly back to the design workflow, and then make sure that the ECO stays in that ECO workflow. So as you can see, there's a lot of features that will hopefully allow you to work more effectively, and also maybe reduce some of the physical paper passing that might be happening at your company. So we saw the general Vault View interface, some of the benefits that has, the check-in, check-out process. And then we also saw from the user perspective, moving a file through that workflow process, hopefully removing some of the physical paper passing, but also building in some automation to save you guys some steps that would have previously required opening up the file and making extensive changes to the title block or to other things. Some of that automation can be built right into to the system to save you guys time. So again, the basics of the PDM system. We had our Windows Explorer interface. So the Vault View, what users will see from their end, they're going to log into that Windows Explorer interface that allows them to see those files, to see the files that exist on the server. And again, because it's Windows Explorer, there's really no limit to the types of files that you can use inside this system. So even if you created a new file extension, you could still pull that in and still control who has access to that file, what types of changes they can make to that file. We also saw that there are credentials required for access. So depending on the credentials that you've been given, that will determine what you can do inside this system. I also mentioned that SQL database that's managing, it's a Microsoft SQL instance that's managing our reference information. So all the information about our file, including the file references, any of that data card information is also going to be stored and managed by SQL. So if you rename files, move files, it's not going to break the reference anymore. And then also, again, that's allowing us to store just additional information, project information, material properties, things like that, that wouldn't generally show up in the Windows Explorer interface. We saw version and revision control. So as we're checking out a file, making a change to that file, checking it back in, the version on that file is going to be updated. And then we saw revision control. As the file passes through our revision process, we can have a revision value applied to our file. So our file moved from work in process to pending approval to approved. And once it moved to approved, we had our alpha revision scheme applied to our file. And then we can build those approval processes into the PDM interface. So if you have existing engineering approval processes, or maybe engineering change order, engineering change notice processes, those can be built into this system so that if you were previously moving a file or moving a printout of a drawing from one person's desk to the next person, doing physical sign-offs, hopefully some of that can be reduced by what can be built into this PDM system. And again, with PDM Pro, you can set up, there's really no limit to the amount of different types of workflows that you can set up for the different needs that you might have. And again, with each of those different workflows, and even in one workflow, you can have multiple revision schemes based upon what you need. So if you had a prototype revision scheme, maybe an alpha revision scheme, and then an alpha numeric, that can all be set up with PDM Professional based upon what your needs are. So with that, that is the end of my presentation here. Again, thank you for joining this webinar.